Imagine being at an airport, just going about your day, when something completely unexpected happens. A white cop, doing his routine job, arrests a black man. Sounds intense, right? But here's the twist. The cop has no idea who he's dealing with. The man he's just arrested isn't just any traveler. He owns the entire airline. It's a story of assumptions, power, and a shocking revelation that nobody saw coming. As the situation unfolds, tensions rise, and the question becomes, how will the cop handle this unexpected turn of events? Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because the truth is more than just surprising. What happens when the tables are turned and the officer realizes who the man really is? You won't believe what happens next. The black man, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, had just stepped off his private jet, like any other regular traveler. He wasn't looking for attention or drama. He was just going home. But as soon as he walked past security, the officer approached, questioning him about something trivial. The officer seemed frustrated, maybe annoyed by the man's calm demeanor. The tension between them escalated quickly, and before long, the officer demanded identification, assuming the man had broken some sort of airport rule. The man, maintaining his composure, didn't react with anger, but his silence only seemed to provoke the officer further. What the cop didn't know was that the man he was addressing was the owner of the airline, the very airline the cop worked for. The officer, caught up in his authority, didn't recognize him. Now, as the arrest continues, we're left wondering, how long will this misunderstanding last before everything unravels? As the officer firmly handcuffed the man, the crowd around them began to gather, whispering in confusion. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't a typical scene at the airport. The black man's calmness seemed out of place in the midst of the officer's rising frustration. The officer's voice grew louder, as if trying to assert control over the situation. But the man said nothing, his eyes steady, almost calculating. What the officer didn't realize was that the man's silence wasn't defeat. It was strategy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the terminal, the airline staff had started to notice something strange. A few had recognized the man from his past visits, but couldn't understand why he was being arrested. Their phones buzzed with messages from higher-ups, signaling an urgent situation unfolding. Whispers of the arrest spread like wildfire, and soon the question began circulating. How could this be happening? Back at the scene, the officer's partner was starting to sense that something didn't add up. There was something unsettling about the way the arrested man moved, his poise, his confidence. Was he someone important? The officer ignored his partner's subtle hints, still convinced that he was in control. But the crowd was growing more agitated, sensing that this wasn't just an ordinary arrest. As the tension built, it was clear. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. As the officer continued to tighten his grip on the man, the tension in the air was palpable. The crowd watched in hushed silence, some even pulling out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. The officer's face reddened with frustration, and his partner's voice grew more insistent. "We need to get this under control, now." But the officer wasn't listening. His focus was fixed on the man, who still hadn't uttered a single word, his expression unreadable. From the back of the terminal, a sharp voice suddenly cut through the murmur of the crowd. "What's going on here?" A security manager rushed toward the scene, his face a mask of concern. He had seen the man before, but only in passing, never under these circumstances. The officer barely acknowledged him, too wrapped up in his own actions. The manager paused, his eyes scanning the scene, then the man being arrested. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Wait," he said slowly, stepping forward. This is Mr. Hayes, the owner of the airline." The words hung in the air, but the officer didn't react immediately, still holding the man firmly in place. His partner froze, the weight of the realization sinking in. A few moments passed in agonizing silence, the tension thick enough to cut through. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, questions spreading like wildfire. How had this gone so far? The officer's grip began to falter, but his pride kept him stubborn. "No way," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Mr. Hayes exhaled slowly and looked at the officer, his eyes softening for a moment. "I'll let it slide this time. But remember this, assumptions can destroy everything." With that, he turned to walk away, the woman following closely behind. Just as the officer thought the worst of it was over, a sudden shout from across the terminal stopped him cold. A man in a suit, his face red with panic, came rushing toward them. "We've got a serious problem," he yelled. "There's a security breach at one of our other airports. We need you, Mr. Hayes, now." Before the officer could even process what was happening, Mr. Hayes stopped in his tracks, his back still to him. He didn't look back, but his voice, sharp and calm, cut through the air. "I'll take care of it. And this time, I won't be as forgiving." The final twist hung in the air. There was more to this story than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Hayes wasn't just a businessman. He was the key player in something far bigger. The officer, now realizing the gravity of his actions, felt a deep sinking in his stomach. This was no ordinary man. And this moment, it was only the beginning. As Mr. Hayes walked away, the scene began to dissolve. The officer stood still, his mind reeling as the crowd slowly dispersed. The reality of what had just unfolded was too big to ignore. He had arrested a man with power, influence, and control, not just in the airline industry, but in a web of operations much larger than he could have imagined. The officer's partner, still shaken, exchanged a look with him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Meanwhile, Mr. Hayes and the businesswoman disappeared into a nearby office, leaving the airport staff to sort through the aftermath. The officer's phone buzzed, a reminder of the priority call he had ignored. The ripple effect of his mistake had already started, and there was no undoing it. As for Mr. Hayes, his resolve had only grown stronger. He had been tested, and he knew this was only the beginning of an even bigger challenge ahead. The incident at the airport would never be forgotten. For some, it was a lesson in assumptions and power. For others, it was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. And for the officer, it would haunt him every time he thought about the man he had once underestimated. Mr. Hayes, still silent, finally made eye contact with the officer, and for the first time there was a spark of something in his gaze, something that made the officer hesitate. The crowd held its breath, sensing that the storm was about to break. Would the truth be enough to unravel the officer's stubbornness, or would this confrontation escalate into something far bigger? The air crackled with anticipation as everyone waited for the next move. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sudden sound shattered the silence. A sharp, urgent buzz from the officer's radio. His partner, still caught in the realization of who Mr. Hayes was, quickly snatched it up, his hands shaking. "What is it?" The officer barked, his voice cracking with irritation. The radio crackled for a moment, then a stern voice came through. "We've just received a priority call. The CEO of Hayes Airlines has reported an incident at a major hub overseas. They need immediate assistance. Is everything okay at your end?" The officer paused, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. The name Hayes Airlines echoed in his ears, and a flood of new questions hit him all at once. How had he missed the connection? Why was this happening now? His partner's eyes widened, realizing the full extent of the situation. But before he could say anything, a new figure appeared on the scene. a tall, authoritative woman in a business suit, moving swiftly toward them with purpose. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. She was with the airline, clearly someone high up, given the way people parted for her as she passed. As she stepped closer, her gaze locked onto Mr. Hayes, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath.